Welcome, dear students, to the MOOC on Political Economy 2. In today's module, we are going to talk on capitalism, accumulation of capital, and the rise of the mercantile class. We all know that the process of capital accumulation in a capitalist economic system is subject to periodic crisis. Now, this crisis is generated mainly by the overinvestment of capitalists who usually aim to make higher profits. Various attempts has been made to overcome this crisis, but in turn, this has led to further regional and class problems, namely the spatial and the social differentiation of production. Past researchers have usually dealt with the problem of capital accumulation, regions, and classes separately. But nowadays, the researchers tend to focus on the dynamic relationship between these aspects, that is, capital accumulation, its impact on the regions, and the different classes. When we talk about accumulation of capital, we usually talk about it in terms of as if the continual process of technical change is not accompanying it. Basically, it represents the expansion of capital on a pre-capitalist or non-capitalist technical and social foundation. Primitive accumulation points to the origin of capitalism as the latter emerges out of opposing social and economic formations. We can say that during this period of time, capital basically takes control of the production process. When that process comes under the control of a class of independent entrepreneurs, we have to think of the accumulation process as a process of emergence of capitalist relations, and so it is necessary to take into account the existence of distinct forms of economic organizations. And we also need to keep in mind that a capitalist economy cannot grow in isolation. So, capital accumulation takes place with a relatively stagnant technology because the individual firm must first attain a minimum size in terms of the value of the invested capital before it can really establish itself on a sound footing. So we can say that primitive accumulation is synonymous with concentration of capital into increasingly larger units. So in other words, if we talk about accumulation of capital in the very traditional or primitive sense, it essentially means that we are trying to focus on concentrating capital in increasingly larger units in the society. And when there is no technical change, this expansion of the capitalist economy will generally be constrained by the rate of growth of the labor force. So we see here that there is a relationship between capital accumulation and employment in an economy. In this type of economy, we assume that wage has to be an effective minimum. So we talk about minimum wages here. Technology is also assumed to be inflexible because we are talking about stagnant technology, so technology is inflexible here. And so we can say that the rate of growth of employment is proportional to the rate of growth of capital. We take into account the length of the working day to be given in this case. Okay. And then if the rate of growth of labor employment is proportional to the rate of growth of capital, this at times is limited by the supply of labor and also by the rate of its increase. This acts as a major constraint, and of course, this constraint becomes operative throughout the process of capitalist development in its various stages. But it is only during this period of primitive capital accumulation, which is basically stage 1 of the capitalist development process, that this constraint acts to dominate that process and defines itself to be the essential constraint or the essential barrier in the method of capital accumulation or in the process of capital accumulation. So, this period, as the classical economists have rightly put out, that the accumulation of capital basically leads to an increase of the proletariat. So, the accumulation of capital and the creation of the working class as a whole over the period are synonymous in nature. We now come to the concept of the wages fund idea. As we have said before, that capital accumulation have a distinct relationship with employment and labor. The period of primitive accumulation is the period par excellence of the classical theory of capital accumulation. This wages fund idea directly links the growth of capital with the growth of the demand for labor. Capital here is seen not predominantly as value invested in the means of production, but as value advanced in the form of wages to the employment of labor. So here we are not looking at capital as if it is meant for investing in getting different machinery or in the various forms of production, but it is meant only to give as mainly as wages given to the various forms of labor. This conception of capital that we see here basically reflects two things. Number one, there is a close link between capital accumulation and employment. And point number two, the primitive level of development of technology that has not yet produced the kind of machinery which requires that larger and larger proportions of the capital of the firm be locked up in the means of production. So suppose if the society really had a very advanced technology system, then most of the capital would have been locked up in the production system. But here we are talking about very, very primitive mode of technology that has been used, and so there is no scope of capital being locked up in those means of production. So we now come to the various factors which restrain capital accumulation. One of the most important factor that limits capital accumulation is limits to the growth of the labor force, because it limits directly the growth of consumption. If the labor force is limited, if the growth of the labor force is limited, it directly has an impact on the growth of consumption, and also it lends an impact on the growth of the market. The demand for commodities in the capitalist sector of the economy finds its first limitation in the increasing number of individuals who are dependent on the capitalist production for their basic necessities. To be sure, this is not the only source of demand, but it does represent a fundamental limitation to the expansion of the market. This limitation is analogous to that which exists in regions which contains large sectors of subsistence production and low overall levels of consumption. So, the coexistence, or if we use the word predominance, of a sector of subsistence production, this can really have some possible impacts. It can create the possibility of expansion as regard to the potential supply of labor. What do I mean by this? It means that if labor is locked up in this sector of subsistence production, they might be attracted to this capitalist mode of production and they might get released from there and come to this sector. So there is a possibility of expansion as regarding the potential supply of labor. In the second instance, it can also act as an impediment to expansion, which can be viewed in terms of the growth of the market or in terms of those institutional restraints, which leads to some restraints on transfer of labor or the surplus labor, which are generally intrinsic to the social structure of the subsistence sector. So, if the transfer of labor to the capitalist sector is considered not from the point of view of simply attracting the labor, but also from the point of view of driving out the labor from the subsistence sector, then we can say one thing, that the expansion of the supply of labor will be a function of the capitalist sector itself. In other words, it means that the supply of labor will be basically dependent on how much or to what degree the capitalist sector itself is going to expand. If it expands more, then obviously the supply of labor will be more. Because if the labor is pushed out from the subsistence sector and if they need to find a room in this capitalist sector of development, the capitalist sector itself needs to expand. So this basically becomes synonymous with the expansion of the capitalist sector. We can overcome these limitations through A, the invasion of the non-capitalist sectors of the economy by capitalist production. B, the setting loose of the labor force in those sectors for employment in the capitalist production. So first and foremost, whatever non-capitalist mode of production or sectors exist, they need to be converted into capitalist production sector. Two, we are saying that those labor who are already employed in the subsistence sector or who are employed in the non-capitalist sector of the economy, they should now be a part of the capitalist sector of production. So in this sense, if I talk about the supply of labor, it also becomes a function of the accumulation of capital. So the supply of labor is itself a function of capital accumulation. So we can say that the growth of the capitalist sector challenges the coexisting pre-capitalist petty commodity forms of production. We can also say that capitalist production is intrinsically more efficient than pre-capitalist artisan production. So the small independent producers, they are generally driven out of production and they are transformed into producers who are dependent on others for employment. So what we are witnessing now in this situation is, we witness that those petty small producers who were basically employed in other pre-capitalist artisan production sectors, we find that they're driven out of production and they slowly become wage laborers in the capitalist system. They constitute a source of labor which is at once driven out of independent production, which they used to independently produce before, by this expansive mode of capitalist production, and again they are reappropriated by capital in the capacity of wage laborers. To the degree that such independent producers are able to remain in production despite competition from the emerging capitalist sector, they act as a barrier to the expansion of capital. So whenever we find that labor which are locked up in the petty production sector and access to labor on the part of the capitalist producers are limited, we will get some sort of barrier to the expansion of capital. Similarly, part of the potential demand for the products of the capitalist sector is also diverted to those of the non-capitalist sector. Similarly, part of the potential demand for the products of the capitalist sector is also diverted to those of the non-capitalist sector. Thus, the capitalist form of production drives out independent commodity producers, and these commodity producers are able to transform independent artisans into wage laborers. Now, we need to understand what factors determine the above process. It is mainly determined by the extent of the cost advantage that is enjoyed by the producers in the capitalist sector. The producers in the capitalist sector are fundamentally distinguished by the fact that number of workers are hired by an individual capitalist who owns the means of production and is able to concentrate large amount of labor into one unit of production, thereby gaining the benefits of the processes which we term as cooperation and division of labor. We had already talked about cooperation and division of labor. Now, what does cooperation mean? Cooperation entails the merging in spatial terms of a number of different elements of the production process previously carried out in relative isolation. While the division of labor, the term which has been made famous by the father of economics, Adam Smith, it involves the division of a given production process into its constituent parts with an associated increase in efficiency. Neither of these processes necessarily involve any major change in the technique itself, nor in the nature of the fixed capital invested in machinery. Nonetheless, cooperation and division of labor are crucial in the process of concentrating capital into the hands of individual firms in sufficient magnitude to finally break out of the narrow confines of the stages of growth. The possibility of a wholly new technical basis of production is opened up by the accumulation of capital into increasingly larger units. So we can say that cooperation and division of labor basically sets the foundation for the transition to capital accumulation on the basis of modern technology. The development of cooperation on the part of larger and larger numbers of workers within a given establishment implies a growing command on the part of the owner of the establishment over capital, not only over raw materials and facilities for production, but also over the wages fund for the hiring of workers. The growth of division of labor increases the amount of means of production as well as the number of workers who are concentrated within the individual unit of production. So here we see that the capital of the individual firms, they tend to expand. This, in association with the natural growth process of the unit of capital, results in increasing command over finance on the part of the entrepreneurs, which opens up the possibility of the introduction of more and more capital-intensive modes of production involving increasingly greater investments of fixed capital. So in this sense, the increasing growth of the individual unit of labor during the period as a whole, which is tied to cooperation and the division of labor, sets the foundation for the transition to the capital accumulation on the basis of modern technology and continually changing methods of production. Up to this point, primitive accumulation of capital has been considered in terms of expansion of the individual units of production. We can say that the growth of the individual unit of production can be considered synonymous with the growth of capital. But the very limitation on the expansion of the unit of production implied by the competition of non-capitalist producers basically restricts the scale of operation of capital invested in the sphere of production. As a result, a considerable and up to a point predominant part of total capital comes to be invested in trade rather than production. Enormous concentration of capital which are not possible in production are possible in the form of merchant capital. And the advantages of these are as follows. Capital which is invested in trade, they are not restricted either to any sort of fixed lines of production or to any geographically limited market. So the growth of merchant capital is not limited by the home market, but only by the world market, which is a product of the activities of the merchants themselves. The growth of the merchant capital is also stimulated by the uncertain profitability of investments in production. The effective minimum of the wage does not function to restrict the gains from trade in the international market any more than the limitation of the supply of labor which restricts the growth of merchant capital. The capitalist producers find themselves squeezed between the restriction of markets on the one side, which is a result of a low level of wages, and small concentrations of demand, and the necessity of keeping wages low on the other because it is required for the preservation of the profit margins. While the preservation of these profit margins do require low wages, these low wages also limit the expansion of demand in the market. So by contrast, merchant capital is indifferent to both sides of this problem. So we can say that during the primitive capital accumulation, the money wage is governed by the subsistence level of real wage and by the productivity of labor. The subsistence level of the real wage is governed by cultural and historical conditions, and the productivity of labor is determined by the technology and the processes of cooperation and division of labor. Technology in general is relatively stagnant in this period. The money wage and real wages are adjusted through more or less perfect competition in the determination of market price. The money wage and the gross margin may alter only to the degree that adjustments take place in the length of the working day, the productivity of labor, and the level of skills required by the workforce. Thank you.